When a woman lets a man go, not in bitterness, not in spite, but in clarity, something profound happens. And it's not just about emotional detachment or about walking away for the sake of appearances. It's about power, but not the kind of power that's loud or performative. It's not vengeance masquerading as strength. It's the quiet, unsettling kind of power that exists in self-respect, in sovereignty, in the ability to say, this no longer honors me, and mean it. That kind of letting go is rare because most people, men and women, cling to potential. They cling to fantasy. They cling to what could be if the other person would just grow, change, show up differently. And so they stay, they argue, they try harder, they justify. But a woman who can see clearly and still walk away, not because she stopped caring, but because she started choosing herself, interrupts a man's psychological framework in a way few other experiences can. You have to understand, many men operate on the assumption that women will stay confused, stay hopeful, stay emotionally available, even when he's inconsistent, ambivalent, or unavailable himself. And that's not necessarily malicious. It's just conditioned, reinforced over time. A man who knows he can pull away and you'll still be there learns not to value your presence because he never had to earn it. And this is where the unconscious dynamic becomes destructive for both parties. Because the more you tolerate, the less he respects. The more you hold on, the less he reaches forward. Familiarity breeds complacency. But when you disrupt that cycle, when you let go, not as a strategy, but as an expression of your standards, your boundaries, your self-worth, you're no longer fitting into his mental model of how this story plays out. You don't give the expected emotional reaction. You don't plead. You don't punish. You simply remove your energy. And that creates psychological dissonance. Because men often only feel the gravity of a woman's presence after it's no longer accessible. See, the feminine has a kind of emotional gravity to it. A woman, especially one with warmth, presence, emotional intelligence, she nourishes, she inspires, she holds. And if a man hasn't done the work to understand his own value system, he will unconsciously feed off that emotional presence without knowing how to protect or reciprocate it. He doesn't value it until he loses it. And that loss, when it's rooted in her clarity, not punishment, hits in a very specific way, because it's not just the woman he misses, it's the version of himself he could have become in her presence. That's the deeper ache. It's not regret over losing attention. It's regret over failing to rise to the moment, failing to become the kind of man who could hold her energy with care. And once that realization lands, sometimes weeks, months, even years later, it stays. But here's the key. None of this happens if a woman lets go while still secretly hoping he'll chase her. That's not letting go, that's manipulation. It's emotional theater, and men sense it. They might chase it for a moment, but it doesn't land. True letting go is clean, is not reactive. It's rooted in deep self-trust, in the ability to walk away not because you want a reaction, but because you know the cost of staying would be a betrayal of yourself. And when a man experiences that level of feminine integrity, it either awakens something in him or it haunts him. Either way, she's unforgettable. Because in a world where many confuse attachment with love, she became the exception, not by being cold, but by being clear. The woman who can let go without resentment, without pretense, and without fear, she doesn't just walk away, she rises above. And in doing so, she becomes the very thing he wasn't ready for, but will never forget. When a woman removes access, emotional, physical, even conversational, something fundamental shifts in the male psyche. Men often operate within a deeply ingrained system of pursuit and reward. Now, this isn't about games. This isn't about manipulation. It's about biology, psychology, and human behavior rooted in evolutionary principles. When a resource is abundant, its perceived value drops. That's not cynicism. It's a reflection of how attention and energy function in relational dynamics. If a woman is always available, always explaining, always emotionally engaging, even in the face of inconsistency or disrespect, then a man, even without conscious intent, registers her as someone who will stay regardless of his behavior. She becomes predictable, and when something is predictable, it loses its capacity to evoke reverence. It's no longer a gift, it becomes expected. And once it's expected, it becomes invisible. This is why loss is such a potent teacher, because it forces the mind to confront what it once overlooked. When a woman withdraws, when she no longer answers the late night messages, no longer reacts to the beat, no longer entertains ambiguity, she breaks the pattern. She introduces absence, and absence, paradoxically, brings presence. Her silence becomes louder than her voice ever was, and suddenly the man is left confronting the impact of what he no longer has access to. But let's be precise. This isn't about punishing him. It's about respecting yourself. It's about no longer subsidizing a dynamic that devalues your worth. And when a man experiences that shift, when he no longer has access to what he once dismissed, he's forced to reassess. Not because you told him to, but because your actions created a vacuum. And that vacuum demands attention. You see, people, men especially, don't usually change from being told. They change when the consequences of their patterns show up in undeniable ways. When you stop showing up the way you used to, he doesn't just lose you, he loses the comfort. He loses the emotional safety net. He loses the mirror that allowed him to feel important without earning it. Is something deeply confronting about being cut off from access that was once freely given. It challenges the ego, and it often ignites what I'd call a delayed emotional response. At first, he might be indifferent, he may even act relieved. But as time passes and he realizes you're no longer orbiting around his half offers, a different kind of awareness creeps in. He begins to reflect, to ruminate, not just about you, but about himself in relation to you. He wonders why he didn't feel this urgency while you were still within reach, why he couldn't appreciate your presence until it became memory. This reflection can lead to growth, but only if he's psychologically mature enough to face it. Sometimes he will, often he won't, but that's not your responsibility. What matters is that your boundary becomes the catalyst, not your words, not your pain, but your choice to withhold access to your energy, your time, your essence, until it's honored, not exploited. And here's where it gets paradoxical. By letting go, by removing access, you often become more desirable, not because you were playing hard to get, but because you revealed the depth of your self-worth. And that kind of value cannot be negotiated. It cannot be performed. It can only be embodied. When you embody that standard, you become unforgettable, not because of the pain you caused him, but because of the truth you revealed through your absence. When you remove access with integrity, not to provoke, but to protect, what once seemed ordinary becomes irreplaceable. And that shift, more than anything else, forces a man to finally see what he was blind to all along. One of the most overlooked psychological truths in relationships is this: people don't fall in love with comfort. They fall in love with meaning. And meaning is forged through contrast, through uncertainty, through depth, through the presence of choice. That's why, paradoxically, when a woman lets a man go, not with emotional volatility, but with centered clarity, she often becomes more significant in his memory than the ones who stayed and tolerated. And this leads us directly into the third dynamic that shapes a man's emotional response: the existential weight of your absence. Now, what do I mean by that? Let's strip this down to its most fundamental layer. Human beings are meaning-making creatures. We organize our emotional world through narrative. A narrative needs contrast to be compelling. If everything is linear, consistent, and always available, the story never really develops. There's no arc, no reflection, no transformation. But when a rupture occurs, when you walk away, the story breaks. And that break, that disruption, invites introspection. It forces a new level of awareness. Suddenly, the man isn't just dealing with a relationship that ended. He's dealing with an identity shift. He has to confront who he was in relation to you, who he became because of you, and who he failed to become while you were there. This is what creates emotional gravity after separation. It's not always about the woman herself, though her presence certainly matters. It's about what she represented in the landscape of his life. Her absence becomes a mirror, and depending on the quality of the relationship and her own level of self-worth, that absence can reveal everything he neglected to notice when she was right in front of him. And here's the deeper philosophical tension. Most men are not taught to value the subtle. They're conditioned to chase the dramatic, the loud, the high stimulus experiences. But a deeply feminine woman, especially one who knows her value and refuses to cling, offers something quieter, something more enduring. And when she's gone, it doesn't hit like a thunderstorm. It hits like a slow, dawning realization that something sacred was lost. Not just attention, not just companionship, but the possibility of becoming more grounded, more honest, more intimate within the container of a relationship that asked for maturity and reciprocity. And because she's not chasing, not pleading, not hovering in his inbox or timeline, he doesn't get the soothing illusion of lingering attachment. He doesn't get to keep the door cracked open. Instead, he's left with silence. And silence, in psychological terms, becomes fertile ground for reflection because it demands internal dialogue. He has to begin asking himself questions. Why did she leave? What did I ignore? What would I do differently now? These are not easy questions. They challenge ego, they unsettle identity, and that's precisely why they often lead to deeper emotional imprinting. You're no longer just a woman who walked away. You become a turning point in his development, a chapter that he revisits not just with nostalgia, but with reverence or in some cases regret. This isn't about trying to be unforgettable. That's a secondary consequence. The point is not to manipulate perception, but to embody truth. When a woman holds herself to a high standard, when she refuses to beg for crumbs, when she walks away from confusion instead of dancing with it, she becomes a symbol of what he still needs to grow into. And the real irony? Sometimes the most impactful relationships are the ones that didn't last, the ones that ended, not because love was absent, but because maturity was. And if he ever gets there, truly gets there, he won't remember you as the one who gave up. He'll remember you as the one who required more. And in that memory, something fundamental shifts. A woman who can leave with grace, not out of pride but out of principle, doesn't just exit a relationship. She leaves an imprint on the soul. And that kind of absence isn't empty. It echoes. Men often confuse attention with affection. They confuse presence with investment. And more often than not, they confuse possession with connection. This is one of the central paradoxes in modern relationships. When a woman chooses to walk away, and not just physically, but emotionally, psychologically, even spiritually, she creates a fracture in the man's constructed perception of control. And within that fracture, a very specific realization begins to emerge. He never had her, not in the way he assumed. And that realization stings, not because it bruises his pride, but because it exposes the illusion that fueled it. There's a crucial distinction here. Being with someone doesn't mean you have them. Access isn't ownership. Commitment isn't entitlement. But we live in a culture where emotional availability is often mistaken for emotional dependence, especially by men who have not yet matured into relational awareness. So when a woman is loving, expressive, and consistent, some men interpret that as a form of submission or permanence. They assume she'll stay, not because she's choosing to, but because she has to. That's the illusion. It's a comfortable one until it breaks. The break comes not when she threatens to leave or when she voices dissatisfaction. No, those signals are often ignored or minimized. The break comes when she simply stops explaining, stops overgiving, stops waiting for potential. She doesn't scream, she doesn't demand, she simply exits the story quietly and completely. And what remains is a void that wasn't supposed to exist, not in his version of the narrative. Now, what happens next depends entirely on the man, but for many, that quiet departure sparks a spiral. It challenges their internal map of how love works. It introduces the concept that someone can love them deeply and still walk away, not because the love died, but because self-respect finally spoke louder than hope. And here's the philosophical tension. What you walk away from defines you just as much as what you pursue. If a woman remains in a relationship that diminishes her, she becomes complicit in her own erosion. But when she leaves, especially after giving genuine care, effort, and patience, she doesn't just walk away from him. She walks toward herself. And that act of reclaiming her energy, her dignity, her identity, it does something psychologically profound in the mind of the man she leaves behind. Suddenly, he's not in control of the story anymore. He's no longer the one deciding when or how she fits into his life. She's not orbiting his inconsistency. She's not waiting for clarity. She is clarity. And the absence of her attention, her nurturing, her softness, it starts to burn, not because it was taken, but because it was freely given and now it's gone. That contrast, that shift from abundance to nothingness has weight. It hits. It forces a confrontation with the reality he refused to face when she was still offering him chances. This is the moment when some men begin to change, genuinely. Not out of fear, not out of loneliness, but because the loss triggered self-awarenessness. They begin to question their own behavior, not just hers. They reflect on the dynamic, the imbalance, the immaturity, and they realize, perhaps for the first time, that love is not an entitlement. It's not something you can possess. It's something you must honor. That even if he doesn't change, even if he stays in denial, the woman who walked away with grace has already won, not in a petty transactional sense, but in a deeper spiritual sense. Because she refused to be part of a story that required her to shrink. She chose to become the author of her own narrative. And that kind of choice, when made from self-awareness rather than bitterness, leaves a lasting imprint, not only on him, but on her own becoming. When a woman lets go of a man who took her for granted, she teaches him the difference between being desired and being respected. And that lesson, whether he admits it or not, often becomes the one he never forgets. There's a curious thing that happens when you stop chasing someone who's playing with your attention. They start to wonder why the game no longer works. And if that someone is a man who's grown accustomed to being the center of a woman's emotional gravity, your detachment isn't just confusing to him, it's destabilizing, because what he was feeding on was not your presence, but your pursuit. See, men who play games often rely on a predictable psychological pattern. It's not always malicious, but it is manipulative. They give just enough to keep you engaged, breadcrumbs of affection, intermittent reinforcement, sporadic validation. It's the classic push-pull dynamic. One moment they're intensely interested, the next they're emotionally unavailable or distant. This inconsistency doesn't repel most women, it activates their anxiety. It makes them want to fix things, to prove their worth, to regain the high that came from those rare moments of connection. But here's the twist. That desire to fix is the hook. And once you're hooked, he doesn't need to offer anything stable because you're already doing the emotional labor for both of you. You're rationalizing the red flags, waiting on the emotional crumbs, and slowly losing touch with your own standards. That's how the game works. Now, the moment you disengage fully, cleanly, and without a theatrical exit, you break that cycle. You stop being reactive. You no longer orbit his emotional inconsistency. And that is precisely when his behavior starts to shift. Not because he suddenly respects you, but because the lever he used to control the dynamic is no longer in his hand. And this is the uncomfortable truth. Many men fall harder for the woman who walks away because her absence threatens his ego more than her presence ever soothed it. But he begins to wonder, why isn't she chasing me anymore? Did she find someone better? Was I not enough? The same man who gave you silence or confusion now starts to crave the very clarity he withheld from you. Why? Because you no longer reflect back to him the image of power and desirability that he needed you to validate. In that void, he is forced to confront something much deeper, his own inadequacy. This isn't about playing reverse psychology. It's about reclaiming your emotional authority. When you stop investing in someone who hasn't earned your presence, you reorient your self-worth away from external approval and back toward internal truth. And paradoxically, that withdrawal often awakens the very desire he tried to provoke through games in the first place. Not because he's evolved, but because your disinterest reveals his emotional dependence on your attention. But here's where it gets even more important. Just because he starts to chase you after you've walked away does not mean he's ready to love you properly. It may simply mean that he misses the feeling of being chased. Don't mistake the pursuit for transformation. If he only values you when he fears losing you, then he never truly valued you. He only valued the comfort of being wanted. That distinction is critical because you're not looking for someone who reacts to your boundaries. You're looking for someone who respects them from the beginning. Someone whose consistency isn't conditional on your distance. You teach people how to treat you, not just by what you say, but by what you stop tolerating. Your silence, your absence, your lack of response to the manipulation. These things speak louder than 1,000 confrontations ever could. And the man who falls hardest isn't falling for who you are. He's falling for the power he never understood you had. Let him fall. Just don't catch him. When a woman lets a man go, not out of bitterness, but from clarity and self-respect, what she demonstrates is something most people, frankly, struggle to embody: emotional sovereignty. And this is where the psychological rubber meets the road. Because true detachment, real detachment, isn't about apathy. It's about power. Quiet, grounded, internal power. A woman who walks away without needing to explain herself, without begging to be seen, is a woman who understands something that most people are terrified to learn: that peace is more valuable than proximity. That wholeness isn't something you barter for in a relationship. It's the very thing you protect at all costs. Now, why does this kind of woman linger in a man's mind long after she's gone? Why is it that paradoxically the man who is emotionally evasive often becomes haunted by the one who no longer waits on his potential? Because in letting him go, she forced him to meet himself. And this is something most men, especially those who lean on power games and emotional ambiguity, try desperately to avoid. They curate distractions, they collect admirers, they keep conversations shallow and connections fragmented. Why? Because depth is dangerous. Depth demands confrontation with the parts of the self that are underdeveloped. When a woman walks away without drama, without trying to wound or explain, she removes the noise that usually lets him escape that confrontation. She becomes, in that moment, a mirror, not a mirror of validation or ego stroking, but a mirror of absence. The absence of the energy he once fed on, the absence of the emotional scaffolding she once provided, the absence of the soothing, the explaining, the waiting. And in that mirror, he sees the void within himself, unmasked, unavoidable, and uncomfortably silent. That's where the longing begins. That not the healthy kind of longing, the desperate, destabilized kind. Because what he wants back is not just her, but the self he was allowed to be in her presence without having to grow. And that kind of nostalgia isn't love, it's dependency. And here's where the wisdom kicks in. A woman who understands her worth doesn't return just because someone finally misses her. She doesn't rush back in because a man is now ready after he's been stripped of distraction. Because the readiness that matters doesn't come from missing someone, it comes from becoming someone. See, what most men don't realize until it's too late is that the woman who lets them go teaches them something. She teaches them what self-respect looks like in real time. what emotional maturity demands, what it feels like to be in the presence of someone who knows they are whole with or without validation. And that teaching, it imprints. She becomes unforgettable not because she was the most agreeable, the most available, or the most accommodating, but because she refused to shrink in the face of inconsistency. She refused to mistake potential for promise. She refused to carry a relationship on the back of hope. The tragedy is that many men only understand this lesson in hindsight. The opportunity they had to grow alongside a woman of depth is gone, and the echo of her absence becomes the birthplace of their regret. So if you are that woman, the one ready to walk away from patterns that diminish you, from men who offer games instead of growth, understand that your silence has weight, your absence has meaning, and your detachment is not a loss, it is a revelation. Because the woman who can walk away without losing herself is the woman who reminds everyone she leaves behind what self-worth really looks like. And some men never recover from that kind of truth.